Thank you so much for joining us today for Early Experiments in Rethinking Architectural Practice. We'll get started with the presentation after I cover a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, by participating in this webinar, you are granting your permission to be recorded and for the recording to be distributed as AIADC and the Washington Architectural Foundation may choose. Second, we'll have time for Q&A after the lecture, so please type any questions you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll relay those to Nicolas after his presentation. So now I'm pleased to turn it over to Julia Trinidade of LADEA to get us started.
Thank you, Katie. I am really excited about everybody joining us tonight and about the presentation. This is our first event for 2021, and we're having a spectacular way to kick off the year. So my name is Juliana Trindade, and I'm currently serving as LADEA's past chair. LADEA stands for Latin American Interior Designers, Engineers, and Architects, and we are one of AIADC's committees. Our mission is to highlight and give representation to Latin American designers in the US and worldwide while promoting diversity in our profession. Our event's agenda consists of a 1-hour presentation followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. Just like Katie said, feel free to send your questions as they come up during the presentation, and they will be addressed towards the end of the session. To do that, please use the Q&A button that you have at the bottom of your screen, and please send your questions over. I'm encouraging you guys. Nicolas is an open book. I'm sure he would be happy to continue the conversation directly with what thoughts you come up with. Now I would like to introduce our speaker, Nicolas Delgado Alsega, who received a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Miami and a Master in Architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He is a principal of Aliata Alsega, a design and research studio based in Rome, and a lecturer at the University of Washington's College of Built Environments. Delgado Alsega is also a founding editor of Pairs, a journal dedicated to conversations with designers, academics, and activists involved in issues of the built environment, published by the Harvard Graduate School of Design. What's special about Nicolas is that he is originally from Venezuela and is an emerging architect, sorry for that. And he offers a fresh interpretation on what architecture is, what architecture can be, and all these thoughts that he can translate into actual architectural projects. So we are honored to have him tonight. Thank you so much, Nicolas, and we are ready to start.
Great. Give me a second here. Okay. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation, Julian. I'm very happy to be here today because when Julian and I first met, we immediately found ourselves sharing similar anxieties and concerns about practicing architecture that we felt were critical to our generation of architects, issues that we felt were being mostly addressed at a very theoretical level amidst our peers. And Julian felt that we needed more spaces where we could have candid conversations in public about where our heads are at, what our experiences have been, and what our hunch is about how we can produce a new generation of practices that can tackle the objects of our concern in very operative ways, in ways that force us to test out in practice the tangible impacts of our ideas. So that's what I'll set out to do today. I'll try to articulate a set of positions about practicing from the place in which I stand now, and to share a project that a group of colleagues and myself set out to build some 6 years ago whilst we were about third-year students in college. And the directions this has taken some of us moving forward, having seen the potentials of this first experiment, but curious about how to overcome some of its limitations. So I'll just ask you to be generous in listening to some of my opening remarks and absolutely skeptical in evaluating them, of course. So we may then test them against the work in practice towards the latter part of this presentation. Okay, so I'd like to start with something that is perhaps mundane to an audience of architects, but which is a fundamental part of my understanding of architecture and to which I find myself going back to once and again as I keep questioning aspects of our discipline and profession. And this is the notion of architecture as an endeavor constantly balancing between theory and practice, something of which, of course, there's evidence already in Vitruvius, but which I understand to play a central role in the identity of the architect, at least since the Italian Renaissance in places affected by the Western tradition. So, the architect is a big thinker, synthesizing the infinite list of ideas, opportunities, and constraints that concern the built environment into an image of what the world could be. And the architect as a giver of form, focused on the craft and attention to detail required to instantiate a single instance of this vision in time and space, having to confront the myriad of practical barriers that the world as is puts up against the workings of the mind. As an architect myself, I feel constantly trapped between the ambition of reshaping the world in the image of a new ideal and work so small and constrained in comparison to that ambition that it leaves me wondering about the impact that designing one building at a time can produce. I think this is an anxiety especially pronounced in architects of our generation. And although we could assign blame within our discipline for some of this, I believe the root causes are a bit larger. At the risk of sounding a bit Spenglerian, I believe the generalized loss of faith in the larger systems that regiment our society in the West and a large swath of the global South in the face of mounting crisis is largely to blame. Growing inequality, the increasing apparentness of corruption in political and economic systems, changing environmental conditions, and the deterioration of boundaries between spheres of knowledge are all conditions we have seen time and again when societies are placed on the brink of an existential collapse. When only a reconstitution or shift of certain ideological principles can serve as remedies. So whether I look at the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan or the collapse or the winter of the Roman Empire, I at least find traces of our present condition, things that rhyme, as Paul Nakazawa once told me, a make or break moment full of disparities, remarkable realities, both positive and negative, that are hard to make sense of together. When as citizens we're concerned about our family, our community, our democracy, or the planet itself, it's only natural that going to work as professionals to think about the ins and outs of putting together single buildings can feel meaningless and too slow. But it is this feeling, one which I see in myself and my generational peers often, that I would like to push against today. That in as much as the world as the world stands to benefit from individuals with an architectural training, doing jobs such as being mayors, policy analysts, economists, material designers, or other such occupations where a greater degree of abstraction in the types of decision being made amplify their measurable impact, there are opportunities for architecture to play a role in the objects of our larger concern. And today I want to articulate patterns and opportunities where I see a potential model for at least some of us to engage in. I began speaking about what I believe to be the foundational myth of our discipline as we know it in this part of the world, not because I disbelieve that architecture could come to mean 1,000 other things. It can, and it has, for each cultural tradition assigns a different place for architecture amongst the other arts, grants it distinct limits and tools, and thus affects what outcomes it can achieve. There is something implicit in almost everything we do that is theory and practice. Also, of course, this kind of mind-body balance. But I think that in places influenced by the Western architectural tradition, this is an ideological dimension to our discipline. And it is a principle at the core of what we do, a sort of aspiration, big and small thinking, art, and public service. And the fact that architecture could come to mean this or that doesn't mean to me that it should. And this is something that I constantly think about as we collectively entertain new tangents within our discipline. At least for me, feeling a lack of space for big thinking in conventional practice, a distaste for the power structures that feed our work, an inability to tackle big enough problems through buildings, or a lack of correspondence between our work and the value the market ascribes to it, doesn't mean things like architecture without buildings, so the loss of interest in form, architecture independent of the status quo, uncompromising anti-capitalist forms of activism, or architecture is pure folly and a cynical detachment from social purpose. Again, not because these things can't be, but rather because to me, they would not be possible without a radical obliteration of disciplinary knowledge and depth, and because they would imply the senseless abandonment of an important place in society carved out by the profession with its corresponding forms of agency. Although I believe there's something healthy about the plurality of architecture-adjacent forms of practice emerging out of many of the issues outlined earlier, I believe they have a much more fertile future and a greater degree of independence through a certain detachment from the establishments of our discipline. And I say this also because I do believe architecture does and should stand for something, partly because I don't think our discipline can occupy a relevant place in society at a large institutional level that enables it to address some of the anxieties felt by our upcoming generation of practitioners just through plurality. And partly because I don't believe that the plurality of practices and positions is enough to impart a coherent and valuable education to students at least curious about entering our profession. In a recent conversation with Mark Lee and Jorge Silvetia, I came across a way of reading this situation that to me is pretty clear. And that's the idea that all disciplines inevitably have something that resembles a center. Conversations that regiment what it stands for, what is its place in society, what tools are at its disposal, and thus what can it achieve. And although this center should be constantly shifting in response to those emergent ideas and practices at its periphery, to be able to respond to some of the challenges posed by our times, the question remains, what are those things that are structural about architecture that limit the range of motion of its center at any given moment? Or rather, what's at stake every time we try to pull that center towards a new direction? And when have we given up more than we have gained? I see this push and pull in very different ways in academia and the profession, probably because they're both affected by our same present, but the forces that assert pressure on them are very different. You know, as academia delves into the what ifs of the issues that torment us all, sometimes forgetful that they have also accepted, like it or not, a responsibility to prepare students to exert their intellectual capacity in the field, partly as they find it at least. The profession finds itself, I think, struggling to resist the forces that more and more demand it to operate like a series of late medieval painters' workshops, producing one-off altarpieces through a measurable and repeatable methodology that allows a rapid proliferation regardless of where they're going, even if they seem different. And this is a problem that I think those of us in a transitional state between one and another environment perceive. But I also know that it is one that people at the heads of large firms understand and worry about, and with whom I've talked about. There's dozens of initiatives out there where these firms worried about retaining talent and retaining relevance are looking for ways to pivot, whether it be the 1% of billable hours that are being dedicated to nonprofit projects, the labs and research studios that employees have the opportunity to rotate through every couple of months, with the hopes that they will produce patents and other kinds of architecture adjacent products, or even the conglomerated vertical structures that many mature firms are choosing to join to expand their agency and impact. So I don't believe this is an optical issue alone. And it does leave me wondering, I mean, how do we work through this moment to come out on the other side with sensible leadership positions? How do we rebuild this on top of the value we are uniquely suited to provide, the assets that we have? And how do we keep from this momentous shift leading our profession into niche practices of limited social worth and consequence, as we already saw happen to some of our sister arts in the last couple of centuries? So, as not to fall into the trope that Julian and I hope to evade with today's lecture, I'm going to walk you through an experience focused on a single building that several colleagues and myself embarked upon whilst we were still students, mostly at the University of Miami, where we were able to put to test many of the ideas and positions mentioned earlier in all the complexity of the world as we find it. Over the course of 4 to 5 years, we designed and built a building prototype that sought to address what we perceive were sorely lacking architectural and urban experiences in the Miami that has been built in the last 20 years at least. Although the project I will share today was mostly executed by a group of 4 of us, Gerardo Delgadillo, Claudia Sorena, Rogelio Cadena, and myself, what we called Studio Miami at the time was a collaborative structure that involved a lot of our peers, mostly seen in this picture. Ginera Agostino, Stephanie Arroyo-Frio, Bernardo Revelin, Andrew Klum, Andrew Tudai, Smith Avasan, Chris D'Amico, and many others. And I have to say most of us are there, but Gerardo is, he was with the camera, so you're missing him. But it was a structure through which we empowered one another to engage in a variety of opportunities that none of us would have been able to undertake alone, because we wouldn't have known how to, because we wouldn't have had the courage to do it, and because we simply wouldn't have had time as students, with many of us also having side jobs. And it's a great group from which also diverse partnerships, practices, and forms of collaboration continue to emerge today. But I'll jump into the project, and I'll start by prefacing the origin of our ambition for this project with a little bit of context. Those of you who know something about the University of Miami will imagine that the school we fell into as freshmen was one relatively centered around a belief in architecture and urban design as forms of civic art, as practices with a responsibility towards the public realm, regardless of the scale at which they found themselves operating in. And it is a school that for quite some time now, but still today, has had a strong interest in the history of architecture, in the lineage of the concept of typology, as well as in vernacular architecture. And I think one of the peculiarities that we perceived about the school, and we talked to peers in other institutions, was the commitment of the faculty to practice and to building. And most of the people we were learning from belonged to a generation that had been very influenced by figures like Vincent Scully, who actually taught at after retirement for Yale for many years. And these were some of the books that were whether we were actually reading or not, felt like things one had to read at one point or another. Another one was Rossi, who was a figure that was very present in the conversation at the desk. Fortunately, in my opinion, Venturi was nothing more than a sinister curiosity for us in an architectural history seminar, and perhaps learning from Las Vegas being the only relevant item to discuss. But Rossi actually had been involved in 2 or 3 occasions, designing buildings and schemes for the School of Architecture campus, the last of which didn't even get past the first meeting in Milan, since it was a week before his death. But between the cryptic texts, the odd built work, and the plethora of anecdotal knowledge that we found about him in the faculty, there was really no avoiding him from the get-go. As I think can also be said about the Creer brothers, whose thoughts and studies, particularly on urbanism, were very present. Leon Creer actually did a building on the campus, and you'd see him every once in a while at a crate or a cocktail making some provocative statement or another, or scoffing at us because we had put plastic components on a wood structure that we were building for a farm, things like this. But he was, I think he was in tune with the fact that most of us walked in there at the end of Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg's near 20-year term as dean at the school, which I think is another key aspect of this story, because although most of us didn't really have much contact with her, we surely did with the new urbanism, many of the principles of which were embedded in the curriculum. A lot of our faculty, declared new urbanists or not, had been involved in the early days when Seaside and the charter of the movement were being drafted. And I won't get into the surprisingly still heated disdain that exists for the words new urbanism in most schools of architecture, or the unreserved devotion for it amidst certain sectors of the profession. I'll only say that as students, it was always an issue that we were debating between ourselves and with the faculty because of how inevitably present it was around us as we tried to make sense of what this whole thing of architecture was supposed to be about. Although I will say that disciplinary politics and architectural egos aside, I don't think anyone in that generation had a more influential impact on the real structural issues that have produced poor urban environments in this country in the last 70 to 80 years than some of the early participants in this movement, all criticisms and problems considered. But anyways, basically all of the people in this image, when Seaside was just a plastic tent in a Florida pine forest, were people we were sitting at the desk with, that we were wandering around Tokyo or a coastal slum in Colombia with, or that we were inviting to play basketball with us and grab late night dinner at Versailles on Calle Ocho, where we had a weekly dinner club because we had heard it had been Rossi's favorite place in Miami. The school, of course, had a much broader tradition and intellectual debate than all of this, but I've shared some of these references because this was a very established generation whose influence we were always confronted with, whether in the curriculum, in discourse, or in person. So you had to respond to the positions one way or another. And I think we took incredible lessons from this. We learned a lot from some of these controversial figures. So this was just to give some insight into the water we were swimming in when we began this project. And I'll just add that in 2008, about 6 years prior to when we began, the office of Duane Plater-Zyberg had managed to put together and pass a comprehensive overhaul of the City of Miami's zoning code, which I believe was the first time they had significantly overlaid these principles in the center of such a large pre-existing metropolis, at least in the United States. And the city was reorganized with a form-based code like the one originally used for Seaside in the slide previous, based on the notion of a transect, which for those who have not seen one before is a strategy to organize urban environments based on a concept first developed by Humboldt in the 18th century to explain the places he had visited in his trips to America, as a progressive transition of living and inert conditions, where habitats are really sections of something larger that is always in the form of a gradient, with more homogeneity in some parts and more hybridity in others, but always connected. So which the new urbanists had taken to look at ways to organize urban environments and their surroundings. And they had developed at this point a complex and robust syntax that could then be applied to almost any urban condition across scales through the use of form-based code, trying to promote the urban qualities that work best across these different forms of urbanization. And that's what they had a chance to try out in Miami at a whole new scale. And we were getting some exposure to what this meant as we worked on academic projects cited in the city, although for us, this really just felt more like a given than a theory, but it made sense to us. And we looked at the city this way. When we looked at the city this way, we felt that Miami was mostly being built out here in the suburban realm and here in the high-rise districts, really that we felt were also a bit devoid of urban life. But when what we considered were that the best neighbors in Miami were mostly here, mostly built before World War II, places like Little Havana, or perhaps more recognizably Miami Beach, where the architecture of leisure, of spectacle, and of illusionistic fantasy was really built on a backbone of humanely scaled mixed-use urban neighborhoods, and where a city of 50 by 100 foot single-family lots had been incrementally developed with different building types that varied whether you owned 1, 2, or 3 lots on a block. And this had all been done with relatively humble means and methods, using the basic elements of architecture for expression and simple features to deal with environmental conditions. Where also every residential street was anchored by a corner store and every district by a commercial corridor, making the neighborhoods walkable, sociable, livable, and lively. But we couldn't really find that many examples of successful architecture or development models for this scale today. As students, we also started traveling everywhere in the region, and we were going on academic trips to see places like Charleston with its side yard types, Savannah's row houses and greens, the strange mix of Spanish and American types put together in St. Augustine, Key West with its culture of porches, Havana and this kind of tropical, neoclassical, monumental city, all the way down to Cartagena and its urbanism of courtyards and narrow shaded streets to combat the heat and sunlight. And we were very impressed by these, which may have seemed mundane or perhaps just charming to a student up north in a college town that shared some of the qualities of these places. But this was what our main street looked like. And this is where we would go grab lunch when we got tired of the food court at the university. So although the city that we were seeing built all around us was not the one that we were most fascinated by, we also had the opportunity to go to places like Tokyo, which was really energizing, and where we tried to understand what were the cultural and socioeconomic circumstances under which these forms of urban life were possible in the metropolis today. And all the way, we would measure and draw these places, thinking that if the dimensions and proportions we saw worked, maybe in the future we would for sure need them and use them. But then we would always come back to sites like this, which for sure were not exciting, but absolutely ubiquitous in the city. And we saw that if this is what we were generally starting with, there could be a lot of advantages in trying to encourage a new way of living built on principles of some of these other tropical and subtropical urban environments. Particularly given the renewed interest in collective forms of living, mixed income neighborhoods, and intergenerational households, as well as the inability of millennials to access conventional housing options in the existing marketplace. So we looked at different lenses through which we could decode some of the elements present in these environments in order to break them down into useful and translatable bits of knowledge with which to design under our given conditions, whether it was the way to treat the ground plane, the impact of different light qualities on urban activity, or the proportions of a street section and how they affected car traffic. And we looked at this code a little bit puzzled, where we saw all the possibilities to do what we imagined and had learned from mature urban environments, but not really many people trying to implement them. And this was ultimately in part due to the novelty of the code, but we speculated that it was also an issue of architectural typology and development models as well, since the advantages of building this type of urban, incrementally developed neighborhoods were so obvious to us. We thought that what was missing was for someone to hit at a model that was worthwhile from an economic and development perspective, and that addressed all the programmatic, formal, and tectonic issues that building in Miami involves today, not least of which is the insidious issue of parking on small lots, which was the deal breaker anytime you discuss these ideas with someone. But we felt that if we could develop one on a single interior lot, we could catalyze a cascade effect when everyone saw how it was in fact possible, and that we had done it and had done well in the process as well. A kind of revolution of incremental city building by a new generation of developments and architects that challenged Miami's more conventional redevelopment strategies, where developers, usually would buy streets like this one, raise all the houses to the ground, clear the lots, and then let them sit for 5 to 10 years to see if a potential political maneuver and market speculations would make the land worth developing into a block-long building one day, all the while making these neighborhoods less safe, dissipating whatever sense of community there was, and leaving them full of these blank patches of fabric. And we all felt a little bit of distaste for the lack of long-term vision of the development industry in Miami, and for the lack of transparency that at least we perceived in the mechanics of how it was that one could be involved in affecting its inner workings. Fortunately, with a great degree of naiveness, without which nothing would have been possible, we thought that if a little piazza in Pienza had contributed to changing everything that people understood about the nature of public space, its role in the city, and the way in which it should be shaped, that through one small building, we should be able to at least help it tangibly change the urban structure of a couple of blocks or neighborhoods in Miami's fast-paced and speculative economy. And that's what we set out to do. If no one would build it, then we said, well, let's find a way to build it ourselves. So with an understanding that architecture and development had always gone hand in hand in Miami, we set out to look for the cheapest single lot in town where we could try to build one of these. A mansion apartment, which is Miami's closest cousin to a row house. Mansion apartments essentially look like this, and they're part of that tendency we saw earlier in Miami Beach, where individual homeowners or small developers took a lot that previously corresponded to a house and densified it into a 2 to 3 story multifamily structure. They're usually like 35 to 40 feet wide on a 50-foot wide lot, depending on the period and whether they incorporate parking or not in the back. And every floor has a unit on either side and a central circulation core, and then the units face front, back, but mostly this side. But this type can also change, or could also change, according to the depth of the lot and the size of units, according to the socioeconomic conditions of the neighborhood, sometimes having multiple units per floor on either side, and a core that would turn then into a breezeway between the front and back of the lot. And the reason we were interested in this type is because we saw it across every single neighborhood of the city, built lavishly or poorly, larger or smaller, in the 20s, or even all the way up to the 50s and 60s. And it was this capacity of pervasive proliferation that we were after in the project. It was extremely efficient, straightforward, and capable of many of the urban impacts that we were after, but impossible to build today for a variety of reasons. And this is the lot that we found in Alapata, a working class neighborhood inhabited mostly by Caribbean immigrants of diverse nationalities, Haitians, Dominicans, etc., Cubans, and that lies east of Highway I-95, which in Miami runs north-south and separates the neighborhoods in contact with Biscayne Bay from the interior neighborhoods of the city. Knowing how fast land speculation in Miami jumps from one neighborhood to the next, promising the redevelopment of a disinvested neighborhood into a vibrant international cultural destination every time, we found ourselves quite at place in Allapattah, where we felt the forces of gentrification wouldn't really arrive, and that we would thus be forced to find architecture and development models that were by design affordable and in sync with the market rents we were seeing. We thought that if we designed our prototype under the more upscale conditions of other neighborhoods, many of the project fundamentals would not be translatable to large swaths of the city. But if we had a model that worked for Miami's working class neighborhoods, the solution would surely be scalable to more expensive areas too. And we were also worried about how much the project would cost, of course, because we didn't really know where the money would come from, nor how much we would really need. But we found this lot, and you could build 5 units, and we found it through a landscaper we knew who would park his equipment illegally on it, and it had been empty for about 7 years. And we found it for a price that in Miami, I don't think no one would believe possible, even in Allapattah, and even for a single family lot. And we looked for friends and family that were already hearing all of our rants about all these things and that might believe in this vision. And we found it. It wasn't that much, honestly. And those of us who could put some of our own skin in the game did. I mean, for instance, my grandmother had left me $1,000 to go to college in Venezuela when I was born, which in a portfolio account over 20 years, my parents had managed to turn into $10,000 and keep me from spending it. And that for sure wasn't going to cover my college expenses in the United States, not even a sliver of it. So I threw it in the pot here, and the land value was so low that even an amount like this wasn't insignificant. And we thought, well, look, we're architects, we know how to draw. We just did a DD set for our comprehensive studio, and we've drawn some bathrooms and some interiors and some CD sets over the summer. So probably we can do this ourselves. And just leading up to the permit, we'll. And then when we get one, we'll go ask a bank for a construction loan to build it, and whatever, which was absolutely not what happened, of course, but it was a good enough narrative to convince us, or we were naive enough to convince ourselves to buy it and believe we could actually do something like this. It also helped, I have to say, that we heard of other students years ago who had built an affordable duplex after graduating from UM in the West Grove, a neighborhood that very distinct from this one, but that shares some of the same qualities. And so this is what the street looked like in front of the lot, which was basically like a highway on the ground, and which in the best of cases was fronted by buildings like these with a door, windows, and a yard facing the street, even if absolutely ill-suited to address the width and traffic of the speed. And in most cases was fronted by these types of structures that you see through the window, with 3 or 4 rows of cars lined up to 2 lanes of parking and 4 lanes of traffic, with giant trash bins on the street and frontages that in no way addressed it. And you can see in this aerial a view of the lot sandwiched between a single family home from the 40s and a motel-like apartment building with a 60-foot setback from the street for a parking lot, which all units fronted, which was not an uncommon version of what had been built in the last 40 years in these neighborhoods. But at least the block, had some of the mix of types between houses and multifamily buildings already. And there was actually a row of some of the less exceptional expressions of the mansion apartment on the north side of the block. But ultimately, this was the street section, though. And it had all the problems of a section like this, or it has. I mean, speeding, the difficulty to cross the street safely, trash everywhere, a general lack of care about everything outside of the fence perimeter of properties, high temperatures due to the lack of shade and the abundance of asphalt everywhere, all of which created an unwillingness to walk and a general sense that it wasn't safe to walk here alone. You know, we would be there and the neighbors would come and tell us, well, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be hanging out here, or things like these. And so we thought, well, if we could just get everyone on board with building this, an instance of this, with a building that addresses the street and units that look out onto them, which was not an easy sell, with trees that could grow to give shade and a building height commensurate to the road width, relegating parking on other services to the interior of the block, that was already a huge deal. And we did. We actually got close to building out both sides of the street on this corner lot, which used to have a ruin of a large house that had been very recently, we had seen it been demolished because it had become a problematic drug den in front of a bus stop. And we tried to do it with a project that came along as we built this one for the corner across the street, which a group of us, mainly Ginevra Agostino, Gerardo Delgado, and myself, took on, and where we experimented with ways of incorporating other programs that were sorely lacking in this area, which developers usually didn't want to take on or invest in, such as semi-public spaces managed by retail, cafeterias or mini markets or these kinds of things. But this is the scheme that we actually ended up building. Aside from the urban and development strategies we were after in the mansion apartment model, we also had some basic architectural ambitions, things that might sound like givens to all of us, but which we saw lacking in much of what we saw being built around us in every scale and income bracket. We were really fascinated by this Albertian notion of the city as a house within a house within a house, where a correspondence between public and private existed at every scale. Between the rooms of a unit, between the units in a building, the buildings in a street, the streets in a neighborhood, the neighborhoods in a city, and so on. And in the mansion type, we still saw slots, in a box facing the setback, which is why we ultimately adapted the scheme into a courtyard building, a type which had been used for small apartment buildings, convents, and nunneries in Miami, but of which there was very limited use after World War II, and in which corridors, landings, and entries were used to spend time refuged from the intense heat and sunlight in Miami, and where we saw that certain behaviors could occur that were already happening in the neighborhood in very ill-suited, corridors and balconies from some less remarkable buildings. For me, courtyards are a very interesting space because they command a very peculiar form of centrality. They organize spaces and programs around themselves, but as a contained space open to the sky, they have the power to communicate a total image that a volume in relation to whatever context never can. Courtyards are environments that can be completely controlled whilst remaining outdoors, which in my view has a really powerful illusionistic capacity. The moment that you cross a threshold between an exterior and an interior and travel through it into a court, you're really transported somewhere else. You hear the world outside, cars, breezes, or a tropical storm, perhaps, which really makes the experience convincing, a real part of the world in a way that an interior space cannot be. But you feel somewhere entirely else, and perhaps just for a moment, you believe that the world could exist in its image. You imagine. And just to bring this back a little bit to the context of Miami, Miami has a really severe subtropical climate with an unbearably long, hot, and humid summer, which is one of the worst parts, and the yearly hurricane season when we all just cross our fingers and say, well, let's hope it's just a tropical storm and it just floods the entire city. And more often than not, the urban development, the answer of urban development has been focused on these kinds of plans, where you drive or you valet into an air-conditioned lobby with limited natural light. You climb up through a tower, through an elevator shaft looking at the floor, so you kind of don't have to exchange glances with your neighbors. and whom you don't know, of course, to then walk through these artificially lit and ventilated corridors and settle into a unit where you're for sure not going to open your windows so the AC doesn't escape and you don't get all the dust traveling in the air, and settle into a unit, and you might have enthusiastically furnished your balcony once you moved in, but then you're never going to open it and you're not going to use it. And in order to rethink all of this affordably and realistically, we thought of a scheme where a void could serve as a public space, a corridor as an amenity, and tall ceilings, window placements, and balconies as our environmental strategy. As a circulation core, the courtyard was a natural way for us to encourage chance encounters between neighbors, residents, and guests, encouraging a greater degree of sociability in the building. By widening the access corridors to the units, we could create a series of porches or loggias that actually made the void of the courtyard usable and livable. And outdoors, always under the shade, abundantly ventilated by the southerly winds, and always several degrees below average outdoor temperature. And where you could sit in the rain or set an outdoor dining table or living space that could extend the life of your apartment out. But that could also serve as a place of encounter, a space that required negotiation between two neighbors and the need to agree, something that we found was increasingly difficult today. And also that could offer opportunities for different ways of living in the building. We were seeing a lot of families living in several units of a single building in the neighborhood, as well as a lot of tenants sealing up living rooms, for instance, to add an extra room because it was an intergenerational household and that was what they could afford. And we wanted to plan for some of those possibilities, for two sisters living with their own families across from each other with a space of encounter, a household with 3 generations lacking an indoor living room that could still gather outdoors, or 2 millennial couples trying to save on rent, sharing a unit, each with a sort of suite, but buffered by a common space of encounter in between. And these were some of the things we were really trying to embed in this plan, thinking of these several interactions of use that the life of the building could enable at one point or the other, of ways of living together and of creating opportunities for privacy and for the individual, but in a building always giving signs of life and of others going out about their day-to-day around you. We were a bit anxious about the proportions of the courtyard that we had managed to fit in the lot, which was essentially a stacked double cube. But whilst we permitted it, most of us actually went to study in Rome, and after incessantly measuring the size and proportions of courtyards all over, we kind of laid the issue to rest, having seen a myriad of medieval conditions where it worked, and finally in Vicenza, in the so-called House of the Architect that Palladio may have remodeled at some point. We said if it worked in Italy, it had to work with the light of Miami. Because if there's something that today's Miami is lacking in terms of livability, is shade, produced by buildings or by canopies, in gardens, in streets, in parks, or in squares. But the courtyard was also a very simple and efficient means through which to provide 2 other qualities to the spaces. Natural light of varying qualities and cross ventilation, something key in making a convincing argument about living differently in this subtropical climate. The courtyard allowed us to bring in these features to every room in the building, including bathrooms, which are almost always artificially lit and ventilated in the city. The units, are also full of wind tunnels, and the spaces are really, we now see, very livable most of the year, naturally ventilated. And between the wind that crosses the courtyard year-round on the 3rd level, or travels through the entry hall into the court, and the amount of shade, these are really exteriors you can be in August during the high point of the summer, no problem. We had conceived of this project as an instance of a repeatable type, as a kind of general arrangement that could be actually built today in 1 lot, or pretty much without modification on 2 lots, actually. And although each lot had to deal with parking, we wanted something that could really encourage the largest distance between any two curb cuts to make the sidewalk safer for pedestrians, at least whilst the driveways were necessary. And we believe that there were natural reasons why independent parties building next to each other would build following the precedent we had set of placing the building against the lot line on one side, which alone was a 4-month battle with city officials and district commissioners and all kinds of people, because even though it was built into the code, it had never been approved, and no one wanted to kind of take the blame for doing something that might have been wrong. And so that would have allowed us to actually create 80 feet between curb cut and curb cut instead of 35 to 40 feet. We also speculated that this type, where we were finally able to reverse the placement of services from the front to the back of the lot, pushing the building forward, was really a structural change. Because once buildings were brought to the front, lots could start to share access conditions to the back. And then different uses could be found for the interstitial spaces in the leftover access corridors. And then once you hit a corner, cars could enter and exit and trash collection and all of that from the short side of the block, and the driveways could be infilled. Or you could even do cross blocks and pedestrian corridors between them, which is a really much needed piece of pedestrian infrastructure in Miami, given the average block is about 600 feet, which walked in the sun and humidity is a lot. But this was our ambition, at least, and our long-term vision for what this one project could enable. But some of it was more possible than we thought. I mean, when Gerardo and I were designing the scheme for the corner across the street that I showed earlier, we did design in the alley, accessible from the side of the block. And in the conversation with the next neighbors over, Maria and another Gerardo, who owned their house and were curious about finding a partnership to redevelop it into apartments so they could maybe live in one and make part of the income of some of the others, we did some research and discovered a variety of legal mechanisms in the city through which neighbors could actually agree and sign binding contracts to allow access across propertyalities in perpetuity, which would have meant Gerardo and Maria could have built out the full frontage of their lot and also build a much more cost-efficient building, eliminating curb cuts, trash collection, and other services from the main street. But what was this whole experience like, and what came from it for us? I think that we appreciate the most when we look back at this project. What we appreciate the most is that the overwhelming amount of encouragement and support we received from everyone around us. I mean, there were really few people, be it in school, in our families, or our general context, that told us we were crazy to do this, or too inexperienced, or that it was very risky, which absolutely it was, and stressful. And I think that this mixture between a certain level of conviction and naiveness within this context was really essential and very unique, I think. I mean, I think at one point we must have had about a dozen professors alone meeting with us, giving us informal crits, sharing information about how to practice, how to engage at a professional level with certain things, testing out the fundamentals of the ideas that we were proposing, and always with an immense generosity. And I don't think that this is something you'll find anywhere. And it really made us understand what it means to be a teacher, what a good teacher is, and what a difference a community can make in your life, in your profession, in everything. By the time the summer of after our third year of school was starting, and we had to get down to work on this, we had already realized that we were going to need a lot more money than we thought to get through the professional and permit fees, taxes, and every cost that comes before being able to have enough leverage for a construction loan. And since there wasn't really turning back, because, well, now we felt people, were counting on us and all of this, we went out and we found it. And one thing we discovered with this process is that there are actually a lot of people looking to invest in new models and good ideas. And more than anything, in good teams, in groups of people that will give it all it takes and solve any issues that come once you realize that, your original understandings of the opportunity were totally faulty. as it, I think, almost always is when you're trying something new. And that it's all really a matter of trust and of being there and, you know, shaking hands and picking up the phone and not disappearing on people, ultimately. You know, and once we did this, we grabbed Carrie Penabad, a professor of ours, and to this day, an amazing mentor, for whom some of us were actually interning in her office. And, you know, we grabbed her walking out of a lecture to talk about how to do this project, which she had been hearing about since before we had the plot, and she had encouraged it at several occasions. And we told her, look, we've got the land, now we have to do this, but we don't feel like we can do it. We don't feel prepared. Can we just have your office do it? And those of us interning there will work on it, and then we'll figure out the second part, you know, with some other partner. And I'll never forget, she told us that we were never going to feel prepared, that every time we did a new kind of project in our careers, we would feel exactly the way we felt now. And she told us we were prepared. So we believed her because, you know, we trusted her. And if she told us we were prepared, you know, and that we should go, we should build a good team. You know, she randomly pointed at some people in the courtyard that we were missing in the team. And we went, you know, we listened to her, we went and we got them. And she said, you know, if you make a mess, call us, call me and Adib, her partner, and we'll fix it. It doesn't matter what it is, we'll fix it. And that was amazing. I mean, that was, at that point, we just felt like, well, okay, we have to do it. I mean, there's no other, we can't cower out after something like this. So, you know, after a couple of months designing this thing, spending days on end learning how to read a zoning code, which, you know, we had done, but not really, and going every week with the straightest face that we could to ask these questions to building officials and zoning officials about egress, and, you know, who must have honestly, they must have been entertained about the whole thing, because I imagine on the other side it was a bit comical, even if for us it was very serious. And, you know, until we had a kind of scheme sorted out. And at that point, we established a partnership with Jorge Treyes from Treyes Cavarrogas Architects, yet another professor whom most of us had done comprehensive studio with the spring before that summer, and who had also been advising us along the way and giving us all sorts of support. And I think that's when we really got to understand deeply how the profession works. You know, anything from like, how do you evaluate a bid? How do you work with an engineer? How much do things cost? You know, how do you collaborate between architects? I mean, that was huge. And how do you draw buildings so others can actually put them together and understand what you're trying to say? Above all, I think we learned a lot about how much consensus between so many parties goes into building something, and what kind of attitude it takes to get something built. And Jorge's amazing knowledge and interest in construction and tectonics as they relate to Miami's building tradition was also fundamental in the design phases that came with this collaboration. And this project is really a design collaboration with them. This wasn't a kind of just an advisorship or a kind of guidance that he gave. It really became a kind of joint product. But, you know, not to let this get too long, I'll just say that this kind of experience translated across all aspects that led to building and occupying the building. Everyone that had some relevant experience that could lend a hand did. Family, friends, mentors, and even other small developers that we met along the journey that had a similar vision, whether it was in regards to how to finance it, what banks to reach out to, or the kind of contracts one could strike with a GC, et cetera. And, you know, just to give an example, my father and my uncle actually ended up essentially becoming the kind of foreman of the job and learn how to build it with a GC, something which my father had never really done before. I mean, my godfather was an architect and they had built our house in Caracas and some of these things, but it was really a first for him and other people in many ways as well. So I don't relate this story to make a case for the architect developer model per se, although the more I look into stories of how projects have gotten done all across the modern history of our discipline, the more I find cases where architects have produced relevant work by playing hybrid roles in projects. You know, whether you look at Lawrence or Alto or Barragan or Puyon or even piano. All these people are very creative in the way that they structure their offices, in the way that they play a role in projects, in the way that they build staking them. I mean, and for us, you know, this was somewhat of a stance, the whole, you know, architect and developer, but it was really a consequence of our circumstance, of feeling the urge to do something and finding it unviable to follow perhaps some of the more conventional tracks within the profession to achieve them. Maybe just because we didn't have enough patience. I don't know, probably it was that too. But from my perspective today, this healthy balance between absorbing as much intelligence from the conventions of our profession without understanding them as limits or absolutes is really crucial now. You know, in the model we pursued, we found a lot of limitations. We were wrong about our hunch regarding gentrification. El Pato, like so many other places in Miami, got its turn as the next place where world-renowned contemporary art collections bought property and moved into, where institutional money sank capital into land and rental income properties with the Opportunity Zones program, I think of 2017, and where architects, designers, and others moved into escaping high rents in other districts. Not that these were or are still very visible impacts in the neighborhood, but the economics did change. And we started seeing it relatively early on after we designed the building, because a lot of people we knew getting out of college were getting apartments in Alapata, looking for lower rents when the rents had already changed. They were still more affordable than other areas, but we also had an eye on what was going on with the land value from the beginning. The project is today actually rented out month to month, mainly to people coming from out of town to work temporarily in places such as the nearby health district as nurses or doctors or people doing residencies, temporary courses, these kinds of things. Latin Americans coming from abroad to see their families for extended periods or to get medical treatments, or even all sorts of people that right now in the midst of the pandemic don't want to be tied up in a lease. And for our sake, I have to say, thankfully, because many of the lessons we learned, we paid for them in cash, you know, let's say, and the project wouldn't have really been sustainable with the base assumptions we came into it with. But, you know, we did learn how to build for as low a price as you can find in Miami. We learned firsthand what are the incentive systems that someone acting as a developer is invariably driven by. And we learned about some of the advantages as well as the detriments that any value-producing architectural endeavor inevitably brings about in a neighborhood. And the limits of this project have only informed our capacity to be advocates and actors for things that we were concerned about, but were not able to resolve. Housing stock affordability was one of them, but there were many others as well. I mean, sea level rise, something that really made us doubt through the process whether this was a project even worth doing in the face of such daunting facts that Miami is faced again. I mean, just to give an idea, this lot was in some of the highest grounds on the whole city, and it was a mere 12 feet above sea level. And we didn't know how to process this information, but we were thinking always of buildings that had to last at least 100 years, that had to be permanent, and we weren't sure that Miami would be there in 100 years. And that was kind of very, very difficult for us to process. But, you know, even other things like forms of community government and stakeholder collaborations, as a way of trying to maximize the value that diverse actors can bring to a circumstance for a greater benefit. You know, that was something we didn't really get to. But we found that doing, in all of its imperfection, in all the ethical dilemmas we were forced to make choices about, was really an incredibly important aspect of thinking about these things. And in many ways, it's put us in positions to have an impact. We felt for a while that we were alone in our ambition for this project, but as we went along, we saw many others that were doing their own experiments. I mean, just to name one, we met Andrew Frey, who is now a great friend, who had worked to draft and been able to push through approval a parking exemption for small buildings like our own in order to shrink kind of the minimum viable scale of development and reduce the cost of these kinds of projects with the aim of increasing affordable housing stock and making better collaboratively built neighborhoods. And he also built his own experiments in this time. He started a bit before us and also finished before us, I think. Or maybe he started, yeah, something like that. And he built his, and he even convinced many of his neighbors on the block to actually start doing their own, and gave them help and shared all of his knowledge with them. So, we found ourselves quickly not as lonely pioneers in something, but rather members of a disaggregated symphony of efforts of people trying this out. Actually, the Office of Tres Architects actually went out to build another one, which they already finished, and which I don't have a picture of, but it is a really interesting one. And today I can say that this collective work has really changed people's perception about what is possible in the city, about some of the most simple but severely ingrained preconceptions that have precluded efforts like these in the past, and which a code alone is not always enough to give people the courage to try. Anywhere you go now, I think you run into people who are doing small development projects, encouraged by changing ordinances, special area plans, the success stories that they're hearing, new policy incentives to build this kind of city. And whether it's related to parking exemptions, density bonuses, or changes, even changes of definitions, like what is a household. We're surrounded by colleagues putting their heads into some of these problems with clients convinced of their potential. In reality, we know that these projects are still really challenging, especially from an economic perspective, but the amount of iteration coupled with the changing ordinances and departmental priorities, and simply the growing belief that it's a good idea, is really helping sort these issues out. And that is incredibly rewarding, encouraging, and inspiring for all of us who worked on this. Not because we think we brought this about, but because we do think that this project is part of that family of events that has really played a role in the last 3 or 4 years in changing, what these neighborhoods in Miami could be. This project, I think, really gave us courage to try and do more and open all kinds of opportunities and not only more work in this context, which we have been engaging with new priorities and new experiments and some of the concerns that I outlined earlier. Gerardo went on to New York where he's launching a practice that actually he decided to kind of go to a smaller scale where he could really experiment with some of the fundamentals of the work that he had been doing before kind of jumping back into a larger scale. Rogelio, who came from a low-income Latin American neighborhood in Chicago and who saw the forces of gentrification displace much of what he understood as a community growing up, took a lot from this experience and is now at Harvard pursuing a master in urban design, where he's developing toolkits and resources to figure out ways in which buildings, in which projects can really be structured in ways that both produce value, but also allow the local community to retain some of these kinds of values, and looking at all kinds of interest experiments of how some of these challenges can be overcome, with his eyes on all kinds of projects in the future. And Claudia went on to Yale, where she's now studying questions about domesticity, beauty, and home, and driven by this problem of how can we design cities for clients that are not users and nonetheless produce places that people can truly identify and attach with, and coupling those with issues of resiliency in the city of Miami, and doing really interesting work. And Ginevra and I are now running our own small practice here in Rome, and launching a nonprofit design and research studio with Carmelo Iñárritu, who's a data scientist and urban planner, colleague from MIT, colleague of Ginevra's, where we're now looking for ways to build creative partnerships between communities, governments, and private agents to rethink a sustainable and equitable future for small cities and towns undergoing severe disinvestment across the Italian countryside. So just to wrap this up, I spoke about a mode of practice, and I clarified that I wasn't talking about the architect developer. One of my greatest takeaways from this experience is the fact that when you build something, people are somehow more prone to believe it. They may be exceptions, they may not be scalable or repeatable or ideal, but buildings The places that we dwell and take shelter in are incredibly believable forms of fiction. Instantiations of a world that we do not have, but someday could come to be. They are physical, they're immersive, and whether you look at it from an emotional or a financial perspective, they feel safe. Once we see something built, I think we all assume that it's possible. And I'm ever more convinced that there is a lot of power in this, in the art that we can make of this opportunity. One of the things we found now that we've completed this building is that all of a sudden our opinion matters in a certain context. They matter to the boards of nonprofits trying to understand how small-scale developers can amplify affordable housing stock, or they matter to clients who are marveled by the outcome and want to be part of what they perceive to be a movement. And we have come to be surrounded by people with similar commitments and convictions to ours, and yet complementary forms of agency to our own, which is, we think, a really important way of affecting change. Our position in this space as architects is not only productive at the scale at which we manage to embed them in the experiment that any one building is. They are productive in the decisions that our advocacy is now in the capacity to influence, in the voice that we as architects have opportunities to express higher up the chain of command than many others in so many types of private and public organizations, something that Jacob Rydell recently reminded me of. A chair that we occupy because we deal in a service that is intimately tied to expressing the fundamentally human desire we all have for a sense of permanence, a desire to be remembered in something with a longer life than our own, and to be remembered for something we consider to be a noble purpose or intent. And one thing does not come without the other. This balance between craftsman and intellectual, private practitioner and public servant, service provider and informed advisor, this is something which I consider is at the core of a space that is still incredibly fertile for architecture. And the models aren't lacking. Whether we look at Labrouste, an architect of unmistakable talent, but also a public servant for his city, or Gian Lorenzo Bernini in the genius adolescent sculptor and architect who had the ears of 8 popes, who redefined the way leaders across Europe approached one of the most powerful individuals in the world with artifice and invention, and played a key role in proliferating forms of architecture and urbanism that reshaped cities across the world for over a century, all the way down to the southernmost point of Argentina. Or even Bramante, an architecture who inaugurated the Roman Renaissance with this tiny building, and whom is alleged may have convinced the Pope to tear down old St. Peter's, one of the drops that spilled the glass for Martin Luther's Reformation, transforming Europe and the world as we know, as was known. On what side of the moral accounting we want to place these people, I think we can continue to discuss, but that their work had an impact on our discipline, as well as the fundamental problems of their age, for me, there is no doubt. None of them alone, always in a chaotic, messy, and imperfect form of symphony, and always in a way in which architectural works were powerful instances capable of inspiring new desires, capturing our imagination, and allowing us to conceive a world yet to be built. A project, I think, to aspire as architects. And I think I'll leave it right there.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. This was an extraordinary lecture, and I think it was amazing to hear all your thoughts and, again, thinking of the theory versus practice and what you had learned in a very empirical way through this project, along with your, collaborators. This is really, really great. So I'll just encourage everybody to please send questions that you have via the Q&A button. And I'll start with one that was sent. It's from Rogelio Cadena. So I'll just read his question out loud. What is your opinion on the timeline of the US architectural model of apprenticeship, licensure, and eventually practicing on your own later in life in comparison to professional models found in Latin America, where licensure and practice begins after graduation. And I'll just add, because I did some research on this separately, it's not just Latin America. It's, most countries in the world have a speedy process where you can graduate from school and start practicing at with more ownership than you do here. So what are your thoughts on that?
At least my experience with American academia, I do feel that there are some aspects of the profession that require working for a while to get even a basic grasp of certain things that are really necessary to be able to be a responsible professional in putting together buildings. But I think that there's many models that are interesting. I mean, in England, for example, or in some, I think, Swiss programs at least, some of that is really built into the summers, or you're kind of forced to take a break for a year and go work and then return to look at the final years of your education with a kind of different lens, right? With a kind of having had a foot in practice and knowing the implications of everything that you learned in theory and in simulacra through actual practice, but having a little bit more time to come back and reflect on what that experience was on architecture to then go out and start practicing. But I think that I think most of our experiences, I mean, some of us already got licensed and are registered architects, but I think we found that we were very impatient, I think, and we really thought we could go out there and make a difference. And we wanted to be correct. We knew the things that we weren't equipped to do, and we went out and we found the right kinds of partnerships to be able to achieve them. And it was incredibly rewarding. So I don't necessarily know what to say about how these licensure processes should change, even though I know they are, and I know they are being shrunken, but I think a lot of people do feel that getting out of school, jumping into these licensures in which somehow you just want to get it out of the way, and so you take a job and you work, and I don't necessarily find that it's always the most rewarding experience. And so I think sometimes it becomes this kind of gap where you took the job you kind of had to take to just get your license. You didn't want to move because it was just easier to stay there and do it. And then it comes with a little bit of a brunt, or like a little bit of and I don't know, I think when you go to grad school, you find a lot of people that are coming out of like a disillusion in like conventional forms of practice after having spent 3 or 4 years, getting a license and doing all their exams and all of these things.
Yes, I know there's no final answer to this, right? It's just interesting to compare the experiences. And I think what's very valuable about everything you just shared with us is this is such a unique experience. I wish more of us had that type of experimentation right out of school, because I think the the longer you spend working outside of school, it's almost like it's easy to get detached from all those ideas you had and all those inspirations and potentially what brought you to study architecture in the first place. I think most of us chose architecture because of its potential to change people's lives, right? Because it's a very potent idea that gets translated into a profession, and it's easy to get kind of, I'll say, taken to the production line and kind of forget all of the power that architecture actually has. I have I made a lot of notes. I have some questions, some are broader, some are more direct. I'll just start with something that's, in regards to the financial challenges and rewards this project brought. So you mentioned something very interesting, that there's actually a lot of people looking to invest in projects like this, or projects that have a good team with a good idea. How did you come across them? And my second question regarding finances is, once it was all built, you mentioned it's all leased. Is it actually, do you have a high demand? Are people looking forward to moving into those spaces? Or what has been what have you learned from this new style of architecture in that portion of Miami? How have people responded to it?
Yeah, it took us a really long time to build it. Like many other things took us a really long time. And that's why I mentioned that, it wasn't sometimes the financials were really tough because of many of those reasons. The building actually just started to be operated relatively recently ago, and there's an overwhelming demand to occupy the spaces, and we're super excited that people see value. We're starting to see the first people that are coming through, and they get it. At least when they book online, they get it, and they come. And I think everyone, something that for us was really rewarding is everyone that comes, or we actually, Jeanette and I stayed in the building for about a month after it was ready, and it was amazing. I mean, also something that was really exciting for us was when you'd see people come, or you'd invite someone to see it, and they would pick up on all these things like, wow, there's a cross breeze, something like. It was amazing. I mean, also a lot of people that maybe come from Latin America, come from tropical climates, and they're used to that. That's a kind of, I don't know, it's a normal part of, what a house does. And, coming here and just finding it and being like, wow, that makes all the difference in the world is to us really exciting and really great. I think what I said about finding capital, I think something I mean also very generally, not just about architecture, but the more we look, the more something that I maybe didn't say was that by taking on this model, we also took a lot of the responsibilities that an architect never takes. And that was a lot of work. It was a lot of learning, right? But it was a lot of things that, I don't know, maybe architects aren't interested in partaking in, but we really, really took on those roles. And those roles, all of them are full of work and knowledge and their own spheres. And that was amazing. But it gave us a great perspective to continue doing architecture. But, for example, I was recently with a colleague that we're trying to collaborate on a project, and he said, well, the problem is you guys made all the kind of mistakes. You made them, you paid for them, like you didn't do them, there wasn't a client, and then you tried it and it didn't work, and then you try it differently, because we've become very, at least I have become very clear about things that I just don't think work, things that I think architecturally are not worth it because they're not worth the investment, the time and the energy and the cost, when you could use that energy in something else, like things that perhaps an architect isn't generally thinking if they've only been on the side of producing drawings and trying to have those drawings enforced in the process, which is how it works here. But yeah, about the question of capital, I think generally we've learned that there's good ideas, and there's a lot of demand for good ideas, and there's a lot of capital out in the air right now. And it's funny when you think, well, where am I going to get this money? And I don't have it. How do we do it? And then you see people on the other side. I don't know. We had some experiences, or we were listening to podcasts, all kinds of things, met people who have the opposite problem. They're like, how do I get this money to produce more than 4% a year for me? And it's like a huge problem, and it's not easy for them to solve all the time. And, high risk and all these things. And so it's a two-sided coin. And I think if you understand that, once you see it and it's clear to you, then it's a little bit less frightful. And when you also understand that it's not only you that's willing to take risk, that we're all willing to take risks to a certain degree. And so when we can see that in others, it's easier for us to approach them. It's easier for us to make asks or make proposals. Really, like, I've got a good idea for you. And it started very naturally. Like I said, like, just like I had $10,000. I put them in. Like, we looked for the people around us, the people we knew, or family, people we had gotten to know in the city. And from there, through a trust network, we always got to the right channels all the way through to the construction loan. We wouldn't have gotten the construction loan, honestly, if Andrew Frey hadn't given us a hand, for example, the developer that we met along the way. And he was super generous in sharing everything with us, all his number. I mean, he was amazing. He was really amazing in his generosity in helping us get through this.
I think, your story inspires us all in many ways, but even in what you just mentioned, the trust, that you can build with others who might not know you yet, but it's really so positive in so many different ways. I'm going to read, we have a couple other questions coming through. Lorena Alvarez is asking, did you have other professionals in different disciplines involved in the project? And if so, which were there? I think she means as part of your core group, you know, amongst your collaborators, were all of them your architecture friends or people from different disciplines?
We were all architects, and we were pretty much all in the same year. And I think the only things that, again, the school had a kind of urbanism. I mean, as you saw in the presentation, was a big part of our ambition was urban ambition. So that, you know, we had our heads in both of those spaces, but that's something that actually we're working through now. I mean, the project that Ginetta Carmelo and I are doing is really a kind of initiative where the three of us bring the kind of core of thinking from a kind of spatial and material and tangible perspective that as architects and planners we have. But then we have a kind of board of people from, you know, the fields of law and economics, you know, EU policy. We have a landscape architect who's a colleague of ours, and we have this kind of board that is really there to either participate in projects where their perspective is very relevant, or to, if not, be our kind of trusted partners in finding who are those collaborators that are needed on a per initiative basis. So it's a question that we are tackling, but at that moment, we're also super into architecture. Like, it was like hardcore. It was like, yeah, we were like super hardcore about it.
Thank you, Nicolas. Next question. It comes from Aaron Grant. Is a project like this something that you will continue to manage as owners, or with the financing you had to find, is ownership and responsibility transferred?
We essentially at the end, what we did was we found the capital. You know, again, none of us could a lot of us couldn't actually like work on this on end, like without getting paid. We realized all those things really soon. And so we established a structure where we built in, we went around and we kind of like, how much is it going to cost? Like the engineers, the civil engineer, the landscape architect, we got some advice. We got some really rough numbers about it. And then what we did, because we also didn't know how long it was going to take us to do it, right? And we didn't know how to do it. So we didn't feel comfortable building in an actual fee into the project for our work. But we said, and there was, again, everyone was in a different capacity to engage, right? Everyone had the real willingness to work. Some of them can contribute to the equity of the project, some of them couldn't. And so what we did is we said, okay, let's do this. Like, we're probably going to do this a little bit slower than an intern, than someone who works in an office would do it. But we're getting paid this per hour as interns. Let's actually pay ourselves per hour as interns, and let's try to reach those objectives, right? And then, you know, like we struck the partnership with Jorge, we structured a fee there to be able to actually produce the material and all of that. But we kind of put ourselves in a situation where like, we're each going to put the amount of energy that we can contribute, and that we are, you know, that we're in the position to do that at this moment, because we were all really busy too. So we didn't know, like, I don't know, can you put 20 hours this week? No, I can put 3 hours. Okay. And that was a really easy way, I think, for us to like do it in a fair way. And then those of us who had some equity in it, yes, remain involved. Those of us who don't, like, not necessarily. But I think everything became such a kind of friends and family affair that everyone is engaged, you know, like everyone completely beyond the kind of scope of their responsibilities continues to kind of lend a hand in everything that they can. I, in my capacity, yes, remain engaged with with everything that's going on right now, even though I'm not the person in charge of leasing and all that. But like, I don't know, the apartments had to be furnished. Like, you know, we did it. We furnished them and whatever, and we did it. We're there for the project, and we have the partners to handle the aspects that we currently can. I mean, I'm not there leasing the building.
Thank you. Next question is, what would you do differently given the lessons learned on this project? And what would prevent this model from being easily replicable in Miami?
I think what we would do differently, first of all, is build a 3D model of the thing before drawing the construction documents, which we didn't. And so when we saw the building, there are like things we then did the 3D model before the thing was built, and we realized some things, and we were like, how do we not see this, you know, drawing sections and elevations and plans? So that's a very simple thing that I think all of us are really aware of. But It's hard to say because it was such an, I mean, the perspective makes it a totally almost like unfair kind of question to make myself. But I think, for example, there were things like, you know, doing all this concrete, and we thought it was like really, you know, tectonic and very austere and very cheap. And it actually ended up, it wasn't expensive, but we could have done a lot of things, which how much it costs us to actually keep those things the way they are. And we could have done things, for example, that were a little bit better. And so we learned a lot of things about building and tectonics and assembly and water and all these kinds of questions that I think we would in there, there's 1,000 lessons that we would have done differently. I think the other is that the ratio of sellable to total square footage, because of the way we handled parking, was really to the detriment of the economics of the project. And we felt, well, if we can actually be a lot more efficient with those things, not that I think in that project we could, but that we then figured out ways in other projects to do it, we really should, and we should really keep our ratios of sellable to not sellable really well tuned, so that this really does have the opportunity to hit at certain kind of like ranges of kind of neighborhoods and districts and all these kinds of things. And also, I think we learn not to be redundant. For example, like this building, that triple loggia, it's really fantastic. It's like really cool. It's fantastic. But we knew that the kind of, after we did it, that one court with a great porch was maybe enough, you know? And so that would have totally changed the building. But those kinds of things of, you don't need it necessarily all the time, right? There's ways that if, you know, we're doing some in as design projects in some more affordable neighborhoods, and we're really being careful about those things. So these things are really, so developers are happy with them, and so we're happy with them, and they can be proliferated, they can be copied. Other people can do them and say like, wow, this works, and this is really cheap, and this is really easy. But then it's not just that. It's not just cheap and easy. It actually makes it makes it different by design.
Definitely. Last, I'm not going to say last, we still have 5 minutes. Next question is from Tuba Jalal. The courtyard model is probably one of the oldest models for housing, with precedences found in ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia, etc. This model is scattered all over the world, with many examples found in Asia and Europe. So do you think instead of rethinking, you rather revisited the past and brought a piece of history that has worked over time? It shows your research and careful examination of history. Do you think this is something we as architects should be doing more?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a revisitation. And that's why I think a lot of the things that I was explaining, it was kind of like things that felt common sense. I mean, I was explaining because that was what we were kind of going through, and because we were really marveled by these spaces that, as was said, are really everywhere and are really remarkable, but we don't see them built so much anymore. And I think that's in part because obviously courtyards required a degree of sharing, right? And sometimes it's difficult to have to generate certain degrees of privacy at certain scales and all of these questions. And this was our attempt to think through some of those questions, and we learned some of the reasons why maybe you wouldn't do it, about privacy, and you know how I think, I don't know, maybe the issue of window placement. Many things could help, but they have their limits. But yeah, I think it was absolutely something that we were looking at. And I think most of us, but at least I am of the position that you build on top of what you know, on top of what you see, and on top of what's available to you. And so all architectural forms and expressions and instantiations that feel like they can lend us a lesson are relevant, and there's space for it in our present, because if we perceive value in it, it means there's something of them and of what they represent in us, right? And that we can connect to. If we can't connect to, we're not even going to look at them, so we don't have to worry about. But there is a thread, so long as you can feel that thread, right?
Absolutely. I have one last question before we close this event today. why do you think there are not many architects doing this? I mean, after seeing your presentation, it just seems to make sense. Makes sense from, you know, the architect's point of view, from the citizen point of view, right? Just having a better quality of life through buildings that are better designed. I understand, you know, the adversity of taking a big financial risk, that you mentioned before, but do you think there are any other reasons why we don't see this type of architecture, whether it's, you know, the architect developer or architect more invested in finding these places and helping develop these high quality buildings? Why do you think that's not happening so often?
Well, I don't know. I guess it's a myriad of things. I do think that it's not something we talk about a lot, and that's definitely, I think, a reason why it's not really done, because you don't know about it, you don't hear about it. I think it's so clear. I think when you're in school, for example, like if things don't get mentioned, you don't think about them, right? And the things that you get mentioned, then you reflect about them. You're like, oh, they did say that. That sounds crazy, or that's stupid, or it's not, or it's an interesting idea. And so I think that really is the first part. And I don't know. I think there is definitely the stigma that if you're not a kind of hardcore architect, you know, drawing and doing things like that, that's going to detract from the value of the architecture. And not necessarily. I mean, I think, for example, developing a practice that is a kind of architecture and development practice has a lot of limits, because it essentially relegates you to what developers build. So from the point of building types and all these things, it puts you in kind of in that camp, and it makes you half worried about architecture, half worried about something else. But that's not necessarily a bad thing if those are the sectors of the city that you want to affect, and those are the means of the developer are complementary with your architectural objectives, right? I think that right now, like, I think a lot of people are rethinking these models because in so many ways they don't work for us, right? Like, just like you were saying, like, I don't know, there's so many parts of the conventions of our profession that I think we all feel limit us and don't let us get places. And I think all of those experiments in a way should be welcome. I believe that they should be related to the act of building and putting together cities, but it's a tough question. But I think we don't talk about it enough, and that's for sure a big reason. Like, did you know, like, that Lurents own a hardware store? You know, like, had someone ever told you that? Like, no way, you never heard that, you know? Or Asplund had a lighting company, or, you know, like Piano, like what Piano does with all of like his like lighting and handrails and all the kind of like hardware of his buildings, or Rem Koolhaas, which everyone looks at as an architect, but really that kind of like research / the AMO, OMA research practice side, that's a really innovative model that actually lets you work on some of the very like abstract issues first, and then naturally get work channeled towards you in the kind of building experiments that follow, right? Because you already know the clients, you already got paid by them, they already know you're good at it, they already trust you, and then boom, you do the practice. Like, those models are there. I just think we end up talking about REM and whatever, and not that other part.
That is definitely very interesting, and I agree with you. We probably don't talk about it enough and don't hear about everything else, even these big names in architecture.
Yeah,
we're doing while producing the architecture that we study in our books.
Yeah.
So we're a couple minutes over time. So I would like to thank everybody for joining us today, and thank you so much, Nicolas, for sharing all these experiments, your experience, and, you know, with such candor, and telling us the good, the bad lessons that you have learned with this exercise. So thank you so much, and we hope you'll be joining more Light Day events in the future.
Thank you. No problem. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.